Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Stony8787.
Hey, what up, Dad?
That is Tony's dad, supporting the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the Edsel, one of the most legendary car failures of all time. But to get the story of the Edsel, we have to tell the story of how we get to the Edsel. And that starts in 1943. In 1943, Henry Ford II was a 23-year-old sailor about to ship out to fight World War II when his father, Edsel Ford, died suddenly at the age of 49. Edsel Ford was the son of Henry Ford. Henry Ford II was Henry Ford's grandson. And at the time, Edsel Ford was the president of the Ford Motor Company, famously founded by his father, Henry Ford. Henry Ford was still alive, but at this point, he was not well. A stroke that had happened in the 1930s had left him paranoid and mentally unstable for several years, and he was now in his 80s. It was clear to almost everyone he was in no shape to run the auto company, and yet, because he was Henry Ford, nobody felt like they had the guts to stand up to him. So Henry Ford, at the age of 80-something, assumes the presidency once again of the Ford Motor Company. Now, remember, this is in the midst of World War II. We are in the thick of fighting, and Ford is producing many of the planes that were being used to prosecute the war effort. Many hundreds of thousands of planes would roll off of Ford assembly line throughout the course of the war, and Ford is a big part of the war effort. So when Edsel Ford dies and Henry Ford is put in charge, this paranoid, somewhat unhinged old man, FDR sees this and he realizes that there's a problem brewing with his war effort.
Yeah, it's a good reason to come out of retirement, but if you're not competent, you're not competent.
Yeah, and so there's talk of the government actually stepping in and taking ownership of Ford, at least temporarily, to stop the problems that were about to crop up. But instead of that, what they opted for was to take Henry Ford II out of the Navy to give him discharge papers and to send him back to Ford to start off learning how to manage the company in the goal of ultimately taking over for his grandfather as president of the Ford Corporation.
It's interesting that they didn't try to find somebody already in the Ford company to do this. It seems like there would have been an executive or somebody that was more experienced, but they just went straight to the source in the Ford name.
It's difficult to know exactly what's going through everybody's minds here. There's a strong feeling in the Ford company, and I assume because these people are powerful and rich that they're able to sort of exert this will a little bit on the government, that there's something special about the Ford dynasty by birthright. I think it's also at this point still family owned. At some point during the course of this story, Ford will become publicly owned, but I believe it is what was called a closely held corporation at this point. So if the Ford family owns the company, it's not clear that you can just stick somebody else in willy-nilly without, again, the government actually taking over. So this is sort of a compromise move to put Henry Ford II in charge and hope that he's better than his 80-year-old grandfather. So 23-year-old, don't forget, Henry Ford pulled off of a boat that's about to ship out to fight, I assume Japan, although I wasn't able to get the deets on exactly where he would have been going, and stuck in the fast track to become the leader of one of the biggest companies in America.
That's a lot of pressure, especially during a war effort.
It's a lot of pressure, and he doesn't step into this role immediately. He's working up to becoming president for 2 years, and in those 2 years, Ford does not do well. In addition to Henry Ford's mismanagement and the fact that many of the other executives took advantage of the fact that Henry Ford wasn't all there and kind of just ran roughshod with whatever they wanted to do, There's also a war going on. There's like factories being blown up in Europe, and people back in the United States aren't necessarily in the car buying business throughout much of this time. So you can understand that things are gonna go badly, and at the worst point, Ford was losing $10 million a month, which in today's dollars is equivalent to around $140 million a month.
Yikes. That's a lot.
You're bleeding cash. And Henry Ford finally does make it to the presidency. He makes it there around the same time that the war concludes. I don't know if it's because the war is wrapping up or if it's just a coincidence where like he finally felt like he was maybe ready to step into that position. But he doesn't have to deal with the war itself anymore. But he does have to deal with the fact that his company that he's now stepped into the leadership role of is in shambles. And Henry Ford, having just left the military, in my mind anyway, this is his thought process. He's got this understanding of discipline and control, and he sees that that is not what is happening at Ford. And he wants to implement this more controlled vision. And fortunately for Henry Ford II, there is a group of guys who have exactly the same vision. This group of men had been in charge of turning the Air Force around in terms of logistics. None of them were pilots, but they had been hired on because at the start of the war, it became apparent that the Air Force had a very sketchy idea of things like how many planes they had, how many people were working at various airfields, how many parts they had to resupply planes. And you can maybe slide by on that in the off years, but once there's a war on, it becomes really important to know exactly where and how much of everything you have. And so the Air Force set up this division of guys who literally were in charge of gathering intelligence on themselves.
I just feel like it's bizarre that you could not know how many planes you have, whatever. It's like, that seems like a pretty important spreadsheet to have.
I think that the fact that you know what a spreadsheet is puts you on a leg up above some of these guys who were in charge at the time. Because it wasn't well run, and these guys come in and they turn that around. They go around and they're literally counting planes and counting parts and counting people, and they were called statistical control. And they were really smart dudes who actually were important to the war effort in coming up with not only just counting how many planes there were, but understanding statistically how the planes should be distributed and where planes were going to be needed and how to manipulate the supply chain. And so they come to Henry Ford, this group of 10 guys, and they say, listen, we know the problem that you have, and we have the solution. We fixed it for the airport, and we can fix it for you. What you're going to do is you're going to hire us. You're going to hire all 10 of us. We're going to come in. We don't know anything about cars. We know nothing about cars, but you don't have a car problem. You have a logistics and a statistics problem, and we're going to fix that for you. Hire us. And Henry Ford II does hire this group of 10 men. This group of 10 men came to be known within Ford as the Whiz Kids. And over the next 10 years, the Whiz Kids did a lot to get Ford back on its feet. They cut waste, they made the company run more efficiently, and by 1955, they were ready to take a bold step into the future. The general manager of the Ford division, Louis Crusoe, believed the Ford company needed to create a new brand, a line of cars that could compete directly with General Motors' Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile divisions. Now, I'm going to digress here just a minute and say it's maybe confusing if you're not well-versed in business administration, as I am not. When you start hearing about these different divisions and Ford and how it's split up, essentially there's the Ford company, right? And then Ford company owns different divisions of car companies. So one of the divisions is Ford division, and then you have Mercury division, and they had another one, or several other ones that were like whole separate branches of the company that were kind of in competition with each other, but also owned by the same people, and other car companies worked essentially the same way, where they maybe had lots and lots of car companies that were separate at the beginning of the car revolution. Bigger car companies bought up other slightly smaller car companies and incorporated them into their structure, but they still kind of retained some autonomy. And the problem that Ford is trying to solve is that General Motors has a lot of these different divisions that are selling to the mid-level customer. So the Ford brand car at this time was considered a lower-end kind of entry-level car, which is what Henry Ford's original vision was, right? There were cars before Henry Ford, but Henry Ford was like, let's make a car that everybody can buy, at least conceivably, right? That it's more reachable to the common man. The problem is, as people get richer, the common man becomes the sophisticate, and he wants to move up into something else, and so he looks to the mid-level car that has a little bit more technology and a little bit more bells and whistles. And Ford doesn't have enough in that mid-range brand level. They have the Mercury, but General Motors has, again, as I mentioned, Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile, and they think the way we can solve this problem is by introducing another division.
Do you think that these cars actually had more bells and whistles and those were considered features back then?
Yes, I do. I know particularly the Edsel was going to have more bells and whistles, and I can tell you about them in a little bit, Tony. So, Louis Crusoe goes and grabs one of the Whiz Kids named Jack Reith. And Jack Reith draws up a proposal for what they originally dubbed the E-Car. And the E, in this instance, stood for experimental. They were going to come up with this brand new car of the future that would blow away everything else on the road. It would be revolutionary. It would have unheard of technology, or at least very cutting edge technology. It would look weird. It would be the car of the future. And this, they argued, was what was going to put Ford into the next level. They had gotten it out of the dumps. Things were working okay now, and they needed to take that step to grow. This E-Car was going to fix their problems. But the Whiz Kids were not all in agreement here. One of the Whiz Kids, named Robert McNamara, hated the plan. And if you've heard the name Robert McNamara, this is the same guy that you're thinking of, because this man...
General McNamara?
No, this is the guy who would go on to be Secretary of State under JFK.
Oh, that's why I've heard of McNamara.
And McNamara hates the E-Car plan. He argues it was way too expensive. Ford already had too many divisions. His vision of Ford was a streamlined vision where instead of having all of these different divisions, you would suck them up into one sort of unified body and they would run a lot more efficiently. And if you wanted a mid-range vehicle, why not just make a mid-range Ford? But McNamara was overruled, and the plan to go with the E-Car was approved. The E-Car needed a name, though. And here's where the most obvious problem with this whole process starts to show itself. Ford can't come up with a name on their own. They're looking for something. They can't find anything. They bat around some ideas and reject a few of them, and finally they hire an advertising agency named Foot, Cone, and Belding to come up with the name for the E-Car. Now, this is one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard. Foot, Cone, and Belding, they get the contract from Ford, come up with a name for the E-Car. They run a contest within their company. They say to the employees, if you guys, whoever comes up with the name that is picked, you will get to have one of these cars. And they get 18,000 suggestions from the people who work with them. Now, 18,000 suggestions is too many suggestions, Tony. I think we could
I mean, that would be like, there's probably weird suggestions like, let's call it the car, and let's call it the Sally.
Oh boy, we're getting into some of that in just a minute. But yes, here's the thing though. Foot, Cone, and Belding, they're like, 18,000, too many. We're going to cut it down. We're going to cut it way down to 6,000. Well, they send Ford a specially bound book of 6,000 names that could apply to the E-Car. Ford hired these guys to come up with the name that was going to be the next one, and they're like, well, we have 6,000 ideas, and you guys decide which one's the best.
That seems like just you sit around one night, like with a whiteboard or something, and you like go through the list and you pick like 1 out of every 100 gets to stay. Then you do it again, and you just get down. Like, that makes no sense. Why?
A lot of these do seem... I've heard of things like this before, where people are having like endless meetings to figure out some tiny detail of a project, and you think, I bet one dude just coming up with the first thing that comes to his mind probably would do as good of a job as some of these endless processes. But they had to take this list of 6,000 names to another agency who did public research, and these guys took it around to the public and asked them, like, okay, which one of these do you like? And they narrowed it down to 4: the Corsair, the Citation, the Pacer, and the Ranger. Now, despite the fact that all of these names would go on to grace Ford automobiles in the future, none of them seemed good enough for the E-Car at the time. And with no other ideas in sight, Ford then turned to a poet named Marianne Moore, who turned down payment for the job of coming up with the name of the car, but still sent in hundreds of suggestions, which included the Intelligent Bullet, the Mongoose Civique, the Pastelogram, and the Utopian Turtle Top.
That's what I want in a car. I want the turtle top. I'm just going to name my truck that, which, by the way, is a Ranger. You mentioned that name earlier.
Yep.
But I don't understand. How is this so difficult?
I don't know. I think it's the fact that there's a lot of different people who have to get on board with this idea, right? It's sort of... rule by democracy doesn't always work when it comes to these kinds of things. Sometimes you do need a dictator to say, hey, it's going to be the Ranger, guys. They also at one point had the Droff as a potential name, Ford spelled backwards, because that was really where they were at. That was the state where they were like, I don't know, what if we just rearrange the letters in Ford? Surely that's a good idea. And when the time actually came to select the name, the guys who finally have to make a decision about what to call the E-Car, they hate all the choices that they have in front of them. They have the book of 6,000 names. They have the ones that the advertising agency whittled down. They have the list that this poet lady sent them, and none of them seem right. And so they're like, what did we reject? What was the first idea we had that we thought was so terrible? And the first idea, the one that had been rejected out of hand, was the Edsel. Now, you'll recall that Edsel was the name of Henry Ford II's father, Edsel Ford. It's a weird name now. I assume it meant something to them at the time. And it's understandable why, as a person at Ford, you would think, hey, here's a good idea to name this car the Edsel, because people liked Edsel. And you got to remember, Henry Ford Sr. had kind of left a bad mark on the company, but Edsel had died relatively early. I mean, age 49 isn't super young, but it's young enough where it's surprising still. And people thought well of him as a manager and as a leader of the company. And so, hey, we've got this new car. It's going to take us into the future. Why not put this man whose memory we all want to honor, put his name on there, and that'll be a good way to remember him. Well...
yeah, because the best way you want to remember someone is to make a car that flops so hard that we're doing a Bad Ideas episode on it.
Exactly. And if you thought that the problem stopped with coming up with the name, that is inaccurate, because things are going poorly on the production side of things as well. Now, remember I talked about how there would be different divisions of vehicles under Ford, and you have to remember, Edsel was not going to be the Ford Edsel. This is not like a Ford Ranger or a Ford Tempo, which I had for a while. This was going to be its own brand name, and so Edsels would actually have their own dealerships. But Ford didn't bother to branch off the production of the Edsel. So the Edsel cars were being built on repurposed Ford and Mercury assembly lines. And the people who were working on these cars in these assembly lines kind of resented being pulled off of working on their division's cars for this new upstart division. And so they didn't put their best work into it. And they're also, I think, suffering somewhat from some of the changes that the Whiz Kids made. Remember, we brought in this group of statisticians earlier who were going to cut inefficiency and look at where the resources were needed. And a lot of times when you start focusing on efficiency, this is not a knock on efficiency, but you can get too efficient, right? If you're running with only the parts that you need, when even one of those parts breaks, things start to snowball into a problem. There's this trade-off between efficiency and resiliency, and it seems to me like they went a little bit too far on the efficiency side because there's production problems with a lot of Ford stuff at the time, and then you add in the fact that these factory workers who are probably already kind of overworked due to the bean counting ways of the Whiz Kids are now being pulled off of working on Fords to work on this new car. It's not a good look. It doesn't work out well. And so the assembly line workers are essentially half assembling the cars, running out of time on the assembly process, and just throwing the extra pieces in the trunk and shipping them off to the dealership with instructions on how to finish putting the cars together.
Yeah, because the person you really want putting your car together is a car salesman, or maybe their mechanic. That makes absolutely no sense.
Also, it's not a good idea to alienate the guy you want to sell your car, right? You've got this guy who you hope is going to be amped up about how great this car is, and you're shipping it to him with parts, like, not put into it.
Yeah, he's like, oh, I'm going to get like 5 of my citations today, like the Edsel citations. We're going to get these moving off the lot. And then it's just... that's a garbage car. It's
basically 4 citations and 1 that you're cannibalizing for parts to make the other 4 work. Yeah.
Yes.
This would lead to the Edsel name being turned into the acronym, Every Day Something Else Leaks.
It's like the Ford version of the Yugo, except a lot more expensive.
A lot more expensive. And one of the reasons that it was more expensive was because of the new technology that I mentioned earlier. The people who made the Edsel thought shifting with the shifter is old school, Tony. It's passé. Nobody wants to have to move their arm down and pull a lever to shift into a new gear. What we're going to do is we're going to have buttons. And they're going to be right where you would normally have the horn on every other car. You'll still have to pick up your hand off the steering wheel and move it to the middle of the steering wheel, and also remember not to honk using the shifter, but this is the future, and the future is buttons. And so they had this brand new shifting system that you can tell wasn't great because we're not doing it anymore, where there was this push button wheel in the center of the steering wheel that you had to use to shift the car into different gears. And it was so complicated that when it broke, most mechanics had no idea how to fix it.
It sounds like it would be complicated. I mean, before it's just like, oh, this lever goes on directly onto the transmission. It has these teeth, blah, blah, blah. Like, it just is so much more straightforward.
Yeah, it's one of those things you can maybe respect from an engineering standpoint, because they did build in the ability to stop you from just shifting into reverse. They had, like, some safety buffers, and there's this whole electronic shifting mechanism that has to work. Like, it's a cool idea, but it's alien to most people. It's not really the kind of thing that you think, yes, I'm going to definitely pay more to have buttons in the middle of my steering wheel. So this is maybe the most maligned feature of the Edsel. I will go to bat a little bit for Edsel, though. It was the first car that had standard inclusion of seatbelts. They were all about that safety, and seatbelts at the time were actually seen as a negative feature, because if you had seatbelts in your car, the thought was it got people thinking about how maybe you could die in your car, and automobile manufacturers didn't want you thinking about that, so they just didn't put the seatbelts in. And then you didn't think about dying, and then you died, but it was okay because you weren't scared of cars.
Yeah, you could just focus on the road and that whiskey you had on your way out the door.
That's a whole separate idea that Edsel is not responsible for. They actually turned it around, so thank you, Edsel, for pushing for that. In advance of the Edsel's release on the market, Ford ran a massive marketing campaign. Some of this was these weird fuzzy photos of the Edsel sort of being hauled on a truck where you couldn't see what it was, but you could kind of tell it looked a little bit funky, and Ford was like, the next thing is coming. They also ran the Edsel Show, which was a one-night television extravaganza that ran in the slot that the Ed Sullivan Show normally ran on. And this thing starred Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, Bob Hope, and many other luminaries of the day. It was so good that it was apparently nominated for an Emmy. But the car itself was not really what people got excited about when they tuned into the Edsel Show.
It's like, that just sounds expensive to me, like all those names.
I read an interesting anecdote that Bing Crosby had Ford produce the show through his alma mater as essentially a gift to his school, so that, like, hey, here's this big expensive production. I like my school. Ford wants me to be in this, so I'm going to have them do it at the place I went to school so they get a lot of money. It's kind of clever on his part.
Yeah.
And the thing is, aside from all of the other things we've mentioned that I think would indeed convince you that the Edsel wasn't a great car, even if it was a great car, 1957 would have been a bad time to launch it. For starters, there was a recession and car sales across the board were down. Nobody was selling cars in 1957. And Ford tries to launch this brand spanking new thing that nobody's heard of and has buttons in the middle of the steering wheel. And you can just imagine how well that goes. And the other thing that Ford misses, again, forgive them for not being able to predict a recession. Nobody can do that reliably anyway. They also didn't predict a shift in consumer tastes. Now, the Edsel was produced with a lot of what would eventually come to be termed market research, where they were polling people and asking them what they liked in cars and trying to find things that customers would respond to. But they absolutely missed the fact that the American public was about to shift into a fascination with compact cars. The Edsel was not a compact car.
No, it looks like a boat. Like, literally from the back end, the way that trunk looks, it looks like a boat.
And the look of the car is this bizarre, very unique style that was intentional, right? Ford sent down the mandate to said, make it look different. And I think they might have forgotten to include the part where they said make it look good, but they definitely did get it looking different. And I think maybe that's okay in a time when the economy's up, right? When everybody's feeling happy and secure, you feel okay about buying something weird, right? You're like, man, that PT Cruiser, that looks good to me. I think I'll buy that. And
that was a sentence nobody's ever said before.
Lots of people bought PT Cruisers, man. Sometimes,
yeah, but nobody thought they looked good. They just were like, it's cheap.
I don't know if that's accurate. I think some people liked the styling of the PT Cruiser because it was a weird thing. But when you're in an era of recession, people turn to the safe choice, the choice that looks what they're familiar with. And when you're trying to sell a car that Bob Hope once described as an Oldsmobile sucking on a lemon, you're going to have a bad time.
It's a great line. I love that.
It's also kind of mean because he was in fact paid to promote it on the Edsel Show, and later he turns around and just mercilessly destroys it. Kind of bad faith, but okay. Still funny.
Yeah.
Now, Robert McNamara, despite having his name tied to this failure of a car for the rest of his life, in fact, fought it tooth and nail every step of the way. In 1957, as he was recruiting prospective Edsel dealers, he let it drop that the car was probably going to be discontinued by Ford even before it was on the market. He refused to let the Edsel division have any personnel from his department, making them hire about half of their people from completely outside the company. And when it became clear that he could do nothing to stop Ford from going forward with the Edsel, he worked to bring future iterations of the car in line with the chassis of other Fords. So at the very least, it would be cheaper to produce. However, this change meant that buying an Edsel was now little different than buying a Ford with the weird hood ornaments, and the public knew it. The Edsel limped along for 3 years, each more disappointing than the last, until at last Ford consolidated the division into Mercury and ended the line for good in 1970. Jack Reith, the Whiz Kid who had gone to bat hardest for the car, shot himself the same year on the day of his son's birthday.
Damn.
This was a rough time for him. I will say, some question on whether it was intentional suicide or whether it was a gun accident, but in addition to the Edsel failing, Jack Reith had also gone to bat for another experimental car, I think for Mercury, that looked even weirder than the Edsel. Honestly, it looked kind of cool and space-agey. Like, it was everything you would think of from a 50s car parodied to the max, and it just never got off the ground. So Jack Reith is coming off of 2 successive heavy failures, and it looks like his end is about as bad as the Edsel's itself. To make matters worse, Robert McNamara reportedly brought work to do at Jack Reith's funeral. Like, he's gonna go to the funeral of the guy who went to bat for the Edsel, but he's gonna get some stuff done while he's there.
It's like he probably just put his Starbucks on the counter, too. Just, like, sitting there, like, getting the... I don't even understand how you could do that at a funeral. But maybe that's what the guy would have wanted. Maybe he's a workaholic.
Supposedly, he forgot that Jack Reith had even died. He was so occupied with other stuff. Later on, he would ask, like, hey, what's up with Jack? And people would be like, he remember? He died. He shot himself. It was his son's birthday. You were there at the funeral with your typewriter. I'm sure it wasn't a typewriter, Tony.
I'm sure it was probably just like some folders and like he was signing things, but still, it's a more evocative image if it's a typewriter.
And Robert McNamara never outran the failure of the Edsel. Even though he opposed it from the beginning, he was still constantly asked about it. As he was part of the administration of John F. Kennedy, people brought it up as like, oh, the guy who made the Edsel is going to be Secretary of State. Let's see how well that goes. And perhaps most insultingly, in Vietnam, there's a Ho Chi Minh Museum where a life-size sculpture of the Ford Edsel is shown bursting through a wall, intended to stand in mockery of the man who fought hardest to kill it. In the end, the Edsel was a failure of market research. It was a bunch of people putting their heads together trying to make a product that didn't really need to exist. It wasn't Ford saying, we have a great idea and the public will buy it because it's great. It was Ford saying, there's a market that we're not in, and we need to suck up some of that market so we can be richer. And that, I think, is always a bad reason to make something. You should make things because they need to be made, and people will then buy them because they need to own them. That was the original ethos of Ford, and rather than following Ford's vision, we don't know exactly if this quote is true, but I think it fits with the man's legacy, where he said, if I ask people what they wanted back when I first built the Ford, they would have said a faster horse. The heart of innovation is building something new that people don't know that they want, not sticking some buttons on the thing that people already have and making it look weird to trick them into buying it. It didn't work then. It probably won't work now. And that is ultimately, I think, why the Edsel failed.
Definitely. It's not real innovation. It's just switching some things up for the sake of switching them.
Yes. That is all we have for this bad idea, though. We hope that you've enjoyed it and that you've learned a little something about history and about the Edsel. If you like this, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. If you have bad ideas that you would like us to cover, you can send them in to badideasshow@gmail.com. We love getting those emails. We will take a look at all of them. We don't promise to cover all of them, but we enjoy getting the suggestions that you guys send in. We will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.